It's a question as old as time itself. Well, at least since March of 2001 anyway. Who killed WCW? WCW closed its doors on March 26, 2001, after being purchased by its fiercest rival, the World Wrestling Federation. Just a couple of years earlier, WCW had been beating the WWF in viewership, attendance, merchandise, and just about every metric. But a sharp drop in show quality and a lack of fan interest led to an irreversible decline. After buying them, WWF had planned on relaunching WCW as a separate brand, which would have taken over Raw, while WWF would have SmackDown. But they struggled to find a new television home for this once massive wrestling powerhouse. It was a dead brand. For the last 2 decades, everyone has had their say in who really killed WCW. Was it Hulk Hogan and his creative control? Was it Eric Bischoff and his lack of adaptability? Was it Vince Russo and his terrible booking choices that drove viewers away? Or was it someone else? In order to figure this out, we need to take it right back to the beginning and go through until the very end. I'm Luke Owen, and who really killed WCW? Grab your shag carpet and join me as I fire up the flux capacitor and gun this video to 88 miles an hour and take us back to the Battle of Atlanta in the early 1970s. Ray Gunkel was a prominent figure in professional wrestling, both as a wrestler and a promoter in the Atlanta area. After his death in 1972, a power struggle emerged between the NWA-backed Mid-South Sports and Gunkel's widow, Ann. Despite the fact she had inherited her husband's shares, the NWA attempted to push Ann out of the Atlanta territory, and she retaliated by starting a promotion of her own, the All-South Wrestling Alliance. To everyone's surprise, Ann proved to be quite the formidable foe. She persuaded 25 of the NWA's wrestlers to join her, and she was even able to get local promoters in 6 Georgia cities to work for her and not the NWA. Then she made a deal with Ted Turner to broadcast her show on his television channel alongside NWA programming. Though Turner was on friendly terms with Ann Gunkel, he chose to stay largely out of the territory dispute, taking a may the best man or woman win approach. It certainly didn't hurt that his previously struggling WTCG channel was making a lot of money from this wrestling war, opening his eyes to just how profitable professional wrestling could be and how valuable it was to TV ratings. Fast forward a couple of years, and in 1984, Vince McMahon bought Georgia Championship Wrestling as part of his broader strategy to expand his WWF from a regional promotion to a national powerhouse. Georgia Championship Wrestling was one of the most popular wrestling promotions at the time, known for its high-quality matches and strong fan base, especially in the southeastern United States. One of the key assets of GCW, though, was its time slot on Ted Turner's superstation WTBS, which provided the promotion with a national audience for their show World Championship Wrestling. By acquiring Georgia Championship Wrestling, McMahon gained something far more valuable than a hot regional promotion. He got that time slot on TBS. And the deal was simple. All Vince had to do was provide Ted Turner with new, original programming that would be filmed at the TBS studio. Instead, on July 14th, 1984, McMahon aired highlights from his USA Network syndicated WWF show and house show clips from Madison Square Garden and Boston Garden. It would become known as Black Saturday and was met with significant backlash from GCW's dedicated fan base, who were not accustomed to, and were largely unappreciative of, WWF style and presentation of wrestling. And those fans tuned out in their droves. Despite later renaming the show to WWF Georgia Championship Wrestling to try and win those fans back, the ratings for WWF on TBS tanked. Ted Turner was not pleased, and he responded by offering TBS TV slots to Bill Watts' Mid-South Wrestling and Ole Anderson's Championship Wrestling, with both promotions going to outdo WWF in the ratings. This would begin the feud between McMahon and Turner that would last until the start of the new millennium and would change wrestling forever. In a 2019 interview with Wrestling Inc., Eric Bischoff said that Ted Turner believed you only need 3 things to get eyeballed on a fledgling network: professional wrestling, baseball, and Andy Griffith. He already owned a baseball team in the Atlanta Braves, so let's buy a wrestling promotion. That's the next logical step. And in 1988, Turner bought out Jim Crockett Promotions and renamed it to World Championship Wrestling, taking the name from the original GCW television show that aired on TBS. You see, Ted Turner liked professional wrestling well enough, but do you know what he liked more than professional wrestling? Making money from professional wrestling. By owning and creating content via WCW and the Atlanta Braves, Turner Broadcasting Systems was able to create original material for their stations instead of buying syndicated programming. This was a cost-effective way to fill up their time slots and, most importantly, their ad slots. One of the primary revenue sources of television channels such as TBS are advertising sales during its broadcasts. It didn't matter if WCW was running at a loss, TBS was still profiting from its existence. But Ted Turner, understandably, lacked the time to run a wrestling promotion himself, so he turned to the most sensible of places to find a guy who could: Pizza Hut. Look, I know that Jim Herd is also a former television executive, but for the joke to work, you need to focus on the fact that he was a manager of Pizza Hut. And look, it's how the New York Times wrote about him in 1989, so it's not just me. Herd may have known how to manage greasy teenagers and slice up greasier pizzas, but he knew nothing about wrestling. Those aren't just my words, they're the words of Ric Flair, who once said Herd knew nothing about wrestling. Herd clashed with all of the wrestlers, but especially Ric Flair, and in 1991 fired him while he was still champion and didn't strip him of the belt, leading to a bizarre situation where Flair walked into the WWF with the WCW big gold belt and called himself the real world champion. And you'll never guess who was really upset about this: Ted Turner! And the NWA as well, but that's another story for another day. I mean, here's the short version of it. All NWA champions had to put down a $25,000 deposit to keep hold of the world title, and Flair didn't get his deposit back, so he just took the belt with him to WWF. Wrestling is silly. Now, I get that might have felt more like a history dump and less of a who killed WCW, but Ted Turner will be a recurring name in this story. For starters, he's the man to bring in our next suspect, because in January of 1992, he fired Jim Herd and replaced him with Eric Bischoff. All while this drama was going on, there was a young chap by the name of Eric Bischoff who was making his way up the ranks, from commentator to executive producer, and before you could say 83 weeks, was running the whole kit and caboodle. Eric Bischoff's plan for WCW was very simple: spend money and bring in big names, particularly ones with recognizable names and faces from either current day WWF or from the WWF of the past. To that end, he brought in Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, two of WWF's truly bankable stars from the 1980s, and Lord Scott Hall and Kevin Nash to the competition with huge paychecks and paydays. With one swoop, he'd gotten not one, but two of WWF's hot young prospects, one of which was WWF champion just 1 year prior. Hall and Nash's deals were so good, as Nash explained years later, that not only were they making more money than Sting, one of WCW's highest paid stars, but that if anyone else came in and earned more than them, their contracts would be raised to meet that new deal. Bischoff also invested in production values, making his product look as polished as the competitor, and, biggest of all, launched Monday Nitro to air directly against WWF's Monday Night Raw. And the spending paid off, and in 1995, for the first time in company history, WCW turned a profit. The Monday Night War was on. And turning a profit wasn't a one-time deal, as the same thing happened in 1996, greatly pushed by the heel turn of Hulk Hogan at Bash at the Beach and the formation of the New World Order. Ratings were up, ticket sales were up, merchandise were up, profits were up, everything was up. But up above them was business. On September 22nd, 1995, Turner Broadcast System and Time Warner Inc. announced a massive merger that saw Time Warner purchase the 82% of Turner stock it didn't already own for a whopping $7.5 billion. Using my super special inflation calculation, that would be just under $15 billion in today's money. For comparison, Endeavor purchased WWE for $9.3 billion. This now meant that Turner and Time Warner owned everything from Cartoon Network to CNN to Warner Brothers to, yes, World Championship Wrestling. With the merger completed in October of 1996, WCW was now under the larger umbrella of Time Warner, who introduced new things into the Bischoff equation like corporate oversight and profitability expectations. All of a sudden, those big contracts to Hogan, Hall and Nash were looking a bit dicey. They probably also looked at the yearly Hog/Road Wild event, which was, I kid you not, a free show to attend. A yearly pay-per-view where the attendance gate revenue was $0 and 0 cents.
Which made 0 cents, am I right?
This shift meant that WCW would now have to justify its existence and performance to a broader set of corporate stakeholders. This put additional pressure on WCW to maintain profitability and justify its expenditures. Thankfully, they were making money, especially as it headed into its most profitable year yet, ending out 1997 with a huge storyline gamble that saw Sting took more than a year off from the ring only to come back and finally win the world title from Hollywood Hulk Hogan, who'd already previously lost it to Lex Luger in the summer of 1997 and then won it back, but don't let that little detail ruin the rewritten version of that history. That Starrcade was the company's highest grossing pay-per-view ever, and heading into 1998, they'd sold out the first 11 tapings of Nitro. 1998 was the biggest year yet, with a record $30 million in profit. You'd think that would be a good sign for WCW, but it was, in fact, the beginning of the end. The full story of what happened at WCW Starrcade 1997 is a story for another video, but it can be summed up as this. Hulk Hogan had creative control in his WCW contract. As the story goes, WCW had spent 18 months doing an angle of Sting going from Surfer Sting to the Crow Sting, staying away from the wrestling ring, waiting in the rafters, all for that moment when he would finally top the NWO and hold aloft the World Heavyweight Championship at Starrcade 1997. And on that day of Starrcade 1997, Hogan effectively said, "That don't work for me, brother." Throughout the years, Bischoff and Hogan have changed their stance on what actually went down on the day of Starrcade 1997. But what we do know is this: there was a planned finish, but no one actually knew what the specifics were of that finish. Sting has said that he didn't even fully know what he and Hogan were going to do in the ring as he was walking out the curtain and heading to the ring. The other thing that Hogan and Bischoff have been clear on is this: the reason they had to make the change to the story is because Sting wasn't ready. I mean, come on, the man hadn't even got a tan that day. How on earth could we make him world champion? Can you imagine a world champion of a pro wrestling company not having a tan? By the way, I was being sarcastic. Anywho, the decision was made that Hogan needed to look as good as Sting did in his loss. The finish that everyone agreed upon was for referee Nick Patrick to do a fast count. The match would get restarted and Sting would then beat Hogan. At least, well, that's what Sting thought the plan was. Nick Patrick on Chris Van Vliet's podcast has said that he was told by Sting that he was supposed to do a fast count. But he was also told by Hogan that he was supposed to do a normal count. He added in an interview with Dave Penza on his podcast that he couldn't get clarification from Eric Bischoff because Bischoff had made himself scarce all day. In the end, Patrick went with what Hogan told him to do because he was more likely to get in trouble pissing off Hogan than he was Sting. For what it's worth, Eric Bischoff has said that Hulk Hogan never used his creative control card, and especially didn't use it at Starrcade 1997. From Hogan's point of view, it was supposed to be a normal count, Sting was supposed to kick out, and he didn't, so it's his fault. Then again, Hogan also thinks that Shawn Michaels pinned Bret Hart at WrestleMania X7, and that was the Montreal Screwjob.
Well, Bret Hart was supposed to lose to Shawn Michaels, I think WrestleMania, whatever the hell it was, 16 or 17, I don't know. Bret told Vince McMahon, "I'm not losing to Shawn Michaels in Canada." And they went out there and Shawn Michaels pulled a fast one on Bret Hart, and held him down and pinned him, and Bret couldn't do anything about it.
There is so much more to get into with Starrcade 1997, but really it's a microcosm of what was wrong with WCW. And remarkably, it doesn't actually paint Hogan as the killer of the company, though he was not helping. Do you know how much WCW wrestlers hated Hulk Hogan? In 1998, he pretended to retire as a way to work the boys in the back and boost their morale. They thought he was gone. The truth was, he was just taking a vacation with a plan to come back when people were happier and just win the belt again. On the Lapsed Fan podcast, Dave Meltzer, when talking about Starrcade 1997, said,
"They were building Sting up for this big thing, but at the end of the day, they were never going to go away from Hogan. I mean, Bischoff just felt that Hogan was the guy. And I can't say, he was wrong, but there's a time limit on everything. And that's the problem, is that I don't think that Bischoff saw the time limit, that Hogan couldn't be on top in that heel role forever."
But even with that blunder, 1998 was set to be a big year for WCW with Bischoff at the helm. And really, 1998 was a banner year for professional wrestling overall. Not only was WCW hot, but WWF, who had struggled through 96 and 97, was getting its heat back as well, thanks to the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin, his feud with owner Vince McMahon, and Mike Tyson coming in to be part of that year's WrestleMania. In December of 1997, WWF ushered in the Attitude Era, where things would not look like the wacky cartoon world of rock and wrestling, which at one point was an actual cartoon, and would put focus on younger upcoming stars like Austin, The Rock, and Triple H. This product was edgier and geared more towards that coveted 18 to 34 male demographic. WCW was doing the same thing. Gone were the days of RoboCop helping his buddy Sting, or Shockmaster struggling with his rival The Wall, not that one. And in its place was a cool counterculture vibe with scantily clad women and violence. For wrestling fans, this was a big thumbs up. For suits in boardrooms, it was a big thumbs down. A lot of big name brands and advertisers were turned off by WCW's material, and Eric Bischoff was specifically told by TBS's Standards and Practicing division to tone things down. They wanted to appeal to a family audience. The consensus was that whilst ratings might drop, they'd overall be producing something that would be more desirable to advertisers. Furthermore, they wanted Bischoff to have his scripts approved a month in advance, demonstrating a complete lack of understanding of how professional wrestling works. Bischoff would later say that Time Warner thought of wrestling the same way it would a feature film and traditional scripted programming, going as far as to say that Time Warner wanted to treat WCW like it was Captain Planet. But while the suits upstairs didn't like the product, there was no denying that it was making money. Until it didn't. 1998 was the year that fans started to turn on WCW. While the rise of Goldberg was very cool, the year ended with the end of his streak in the dumbest of fashions, and 1999 started with a reunion of the NWO to groans from the fans. The company had a roster full of potential in its young and upcoming stars, but they never pushed them. And this was frustrating for the rest of the talent. There was a glass ceiling in WCW. Chris Jericho jumped ship to WWF in the summer of '99, and a few months later, WCW saw the departures of Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Perry Saturn, and Dean Malenko to the WWF, while fellow frustrated mid-carder Raven returned to ECW. It wasn't just wrestlers who were frustrated. Fans were frustrated too. Attendance dropped, merchandise dropped, ratings dropped, pay-per-view buy rates dropped. Time Warner saw the writing on the wall and relieved Eric Bischoff of his duties in mid-1999 and brought in our next suspect. Vince Russo was thought to be the true genius behind WWF's meteoric rise. Turns out he wasn't, and the product only got worse. Russo and his writing partner Ed Ferreira left their WWF jobs because they felt they were being pushed too much when it came to writing TV, which was only going to get worse because WWF was set to launch a second show called SmackDown. So the pair left for much bigger paychecks and much greener pastures in WCW, which hilariously was also adding a second show. Russo's run in WCW can best be described as a disaster. Week-to-week television was chaos. Storylines didn't make sense, and there was a lack of focus on in-ring wrestling, which is something that WCW had excelled in with its undercard. Wrestlers were given silly gimmicks, titles were vacated, mums were put on poles. It was a mess of a show. And while the ratings did go up for the first few weeks, they started to tank. Russo was such a disaster for WCW that less than 1 year into his creative run, Eric Bischoff was brought back, the idea being that the man behind the NWO and the man behind WWF's Attitude Era would equal total success. Spoilers, it didn't. Perhaps Russo's biggest blunder came when he tried to do a worked shoot angle based around Hulk Hogan's creative control. At Bash at the Beach 2000, Hogan faced Jeff Jarrett for the World Heavyweight Championship in the middle of the card, where the plan was that Jarrett would lay down for Hogan at the request of Vince Russo because, in storyline, Hogan had played his creative control and he wanted to win the title. Jarrett, rather than do a wrestling match, would just lay down for Hogan and Hogan would win the belt. Hogan would then cut a promo on Russo saying that this was all bullshit and he would leave, with a new world champion being crowned in the main event between Jeff Jarrett and Booker T. Hogan would then return for a big show later in the year, either Halloween Havoc or Starrcade, and we could have a champion versus champion match to crown a true, undisputed world champion. The first half of this went fine. Hogan came out and pinned Jarrett, who laid down for him, and Hogan cut his promo saying that this was all bullshit. Hogan then left for real, and therefore wasn't there to see Vince Russo come out later in the show to cut a promo that Hogan didn't know he was going to cut. And in this promo, Vince Russo called him a bald son of a bitch. When Hogan heard what Russo had said about him, he sued Russo and WCW and never returned. The truly dumb thing about all of this is that it wasn't just the fans they were trying to work. It was also the talent in the back. Hogan and Russo had an argument in front of everyone. Hogan claimed he'd been double-crossed when Jarrett laid down for him, and Bischoff flew home during the show and didn't come to Nitro the following night. Problem was, very few actually believed it was real, and that might be because this wasn't the first time they tried this. They literally did an angle at Halloween Havoc 1999 where Hogan whispered it into Sting's ear before their title match and laid down for him so Sting could retain his title, which he later lost to Goldberg in the main event. All of that was done, by the way, because Russo really had a boner for turning Sting heel. Sting! Bearing in mind that WCW turned a profit of $30 million in 1998, in 1999, WCW lost around $9 million. In 2000, the company lost $62.3 million, with reports they were on track to lose $80 million before they started cutting costs. But while all of that huge revenue loss contributed to the fall of WCW, there was something larger that was the death of WCW. WCW was a sinking ship, but Ted Turner was far more preoccupied with other business matters. In January 2000, AOL announced that it wanted to buy Time Warner for an incredible $183 billion. Getting out that inflation calculation one more time, that would be $323.8 billion in today's money. You could buy 19.6 WWEs for that sort of cash. Ted Turner was not interested in a merger with AOL, instead pushing for them to buy NBC. But Time Warner CEO Gerald Levin saw it a different way. He saw that AOL was a company that was growing rapidly and it was already worth twice as much as Time Warner was now. At this rate, just imagine how much it could be worth. I sure hope there aren't any bubbles around here. Time Warner's board voted in favor of the merger with a 45 to 55 exchange ratio in favor of AOL, and AOL Time Warner came to be. In the wake of the merger, the power dynamics within the company began to shift. Turner, who had previously been the chairperson of Time Warner, became the vice chairman of the new conglomerate. He was unhappy about this, feeling that he was being pushed aside from his own company. He would later tell The New Yorker, "Vice chairman is usually a title you give to someone you can't figure out what else to do with." Before, he'd had considerable autonomy over his network and properties like WCW, but now he found that his influence had been significantly reduced in this new corporate structure. The merger of AOL Time Warner was completed in February 2000, and in March 2000, the dot-com bubble burst. Uh-oh, AOL stock plummeted, and this led to significant financial strain on the newly merged company, prompting a reassessment of its assets and a shift in corporate priorities. In 2001, the company decided to offload non-core assets to recuperate from its financial troubles. Now, what do we have around here that isn't making us any money? Oh, I know! How about this wrestling company that just lost $62 million? A chap named Jamie Kellner was made the head of TBS following the merger in 2000, and one thing is quite clear about Jamie Kellner. He does not like pro wrestling. In fact, I don't think he likes much of anything. He also cancelled Batman the Animated Series, Animaniacs, Pinky and the Brain Freakazoid, and made Batman Beyond the more kid-friendly version instead of the cool version that it could have been. Anywho, he's the guy that made the call to kill WCW, mostly because the company was losing so much money. As Guy Evans wrote in his book Nitro, in the post-merger environment, the new conglomerate was able to write down money-losing operations, essentially eliminating those losses because of their irrelevancy moving forward. Eric Bischoff tried to buy WCW in conjunction with Mandalay Sports Entertainment and had one request as part of his purchase. They got to keep their time slot on TNT and TBS. Kellner, who did not want wrestling on TNT or TBS, said no. And therefore they decided to sell WCW to Vince McMahon and therefore get wrestling off their network. Eric Bischoff would later say on the rather excellent Monday Night War documentary DVD that WWE released that without the time slot, without TV, WCW was effectively worthless. And that, dear viewers, is how WCW died. So who killed WCW? Really, the answer's Jamie Kellner. He was the one who made the call to pull the plug and kill the promotion. But really, Kellner only made that call because WCW was losing so much money. If it was profitable, there's a chance he wouldn't have closed the doors. And why was WCW not making any money? Well, because Vince Russo had made lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of bad decisions, and he turned all the fans away. He took a company that turned a profit of $30 million and made it into one that lost over $60 million. But Russo was only there to fix the mess that Bischoff had put the company in. Russo is an easy scapegoat, but Bischoff's refusal to look past Hogan is a huge contributing factor to the death of WCW. Hogan had a shelf life, and Bischoff, and really Hogan, could not see that. And giving Hogan creative control to say that don't work for me, brother, from the get-go led to a lot of issues on what was supposed to be their biggest shows. Bischoff also spent huge money on big contracts that were so expensive that when WWF bought WCW, they didn't pick up a lot of the Time Warner contracts for the likes of Hogan, Nash, Hall, Goldberg, etc., because it would have upset their own pay structure. But perhaps the person who killed WCW was the man who created it in the first place. A lot of WCW's problems can be traced back to Ted Turner's decision to merge with Time Warner in 1995. If Turner hadn't made that merger, they wouldn't have been involved in the AOL merger of 2000, which wouldn't have brought in Jamie Kellner, who pulled the trigger on the death of WCW. Turner lost a lot of power with the Time Warner merger, and even more with the AOL one. Eric Bischoff even argues that once Turner lost his power after the Time Warner merger, he was no longer able to have Eric's back and sign off on his big money spending. He now had other people to answer to who didn't like the way he was spending money, like giving wrestlers big contracts. You could make the argument for any of these people being the ultimate reason for the downfall of WCW, but in actuality, it was all of them.
I was heartbroken that Punk left.
Who is that?
One of the high points of my life. What was I thinking? Was it the copium? He does love wrestling. I don't know why Luke didn't tell me. Bit of tension there.
Publicly offering CM Punk $1 million.
Okay, just stop it. Just stop it immediately.